Hey folks, this is Kelani. Oh boy, has this been an interesting week. While we now have access to a whole bunch of new content, it seems like the North American servers were in a bit of a weird spot there for a while. It was almost like we were back in beta. If you've been hiding under a rock since Tuesday, or maybe you're just hanging out over in the EU realms with no idea what's been going on, the North American realms were riddled with bugs even before the server reset early on Tuesday morning. Seriously, we were wondering whether or not to call in an exterminator team, and these weren't simple bugs like a world quest not working or hilarious bugs like Rep Paladin Seals doing damage 1000 times faster than they're supposed to. That one was a fun bug if any of you remember it back in Dragon Soul. Good times. These bugs weren't even in the same category of the exploits that may or may not have been happening with world quests. These bugs were ones you couldn't necessarily avoid, which potentially makes them even worse. So let's dig a little deeper and have a look at exactly what happened, what problems it caused, and why so many people were calling on Blizzard to roll back the servers on Tuesday. Perhaps the largest, most widespread and most damaging bug was related to the Mythic Plus weekly cache. Now obviously with Mythic Plus opening up just this very week, you would expect everybody's weekly cache to be empty, but if you were logged on into Azeroth early enough on Tuesday, you might have been pleasantly surprised. Any player who had done some Mythic Plus dungeons in the last week of Legion just before Battle for Azeroth's launch were greeted with a whole bunch of items in their Mythic Plus cache. Players who had been pushing keys and had done over a plus 10 were basically handed item level 380 pieces of gear on a silver platter. Some players would have received up to 3 items. That's a ridiculous boost of gear that just couldn't have come from any legit source in the game right now, but plenty of players were opening up their cache for some free items. Obviously that's a pretty huge deal. I bet the majority of players did at least one Mythic Plus dungeon in that last week of Legion, and chances are if you were running Mythic Plus dungeons then it was going to be a decently high key anyways. We were at the end of the expansion after all. It wasn't unusual for players to be clearing above Mythic Plus 20s, and you only needed a 10 to get the crazy rewards. Thankfully it was fixed fairly quickly, but you still have players running around with gear they weren't supposed to be able to get yet. That poses a few problems when the first raid tier also came out this week. It might not seem like a lot on the face of things, a few 380 pieces of gear here and there, but when you have an entire raid running around with 3 pieces of Mythic raid gear, that's a huge boost to the raid overall. I wonder how many heroic bosses were killed this week with these bugged items, and I wonder if those same guilds will be able to clear them again next week just as easily after the items have been removed. I'm thinking probably not, but alas, after hours and hours of Reddit being blown up with thread after thread of players calling for the servers to be rolled back to fix the entirety of the issue, Blizzard announced that they had indeed fixed the root of the problem and would be combing through their database to remove any items which were received from bugged Mythic Plus weekly cache. So, job's a good one, we're done and dusted here. Crisis averted. Or maybe not. These items created a really uneven playing field for a lot of guilds and players. I wouldn't be surprised if rankings for this week's boss kills weren't fully taken into account simply because of the magnitude of these bugs. I wouldn't pay any special attention to early heroic kills from guilds at this tier at any rate, and I'm really thankful this kind of bug happened now instead of Mythic Raids opening week. I mean, I'm keeping my fingers crossed it doesn't happen again, but I would feel really bad for all of the players who put in so much time and effort into their Mythic progress for something like this to tip the odds so unfairly. It might seem a little lame or sad to some of you, but there are players who pour an enormous amount of effort into the raiding scene, and we should all have the chance to play on even footing. Thankfully, normal and heroic rankings don't mean too much in the grand scheme of things, but not every reward gained from the bug caches was removed. Players also received a large chunk of artifact power. We're not too sure how much because numbers have been flying all over the place regarding this little piece of information. Some rumours are saying they all got 100,000 artifact power, which seems absurd to me. It was probably a few thousand, but it's still a large chunk that will give them a little bump ahead of anyone who was either too late to pick up their bugged cache, didn't have one to open, or just didn't know about the problem altogether. And there are plenty of other bugs which haven't been fully addressed too. Quite a lot of them seem to stem from doing activities towards the end of Legion. Another one which is tied to running Mythic Plus dungeons in the last week of Legion affected the keys that certain players were able to obtain from their first Mythic dungeon run this week. I've seen plus 21 keys, plus 16 keys, my wife got a plus 12 key and I personally got a plus 10 key. We actually got our keys after the dev team said they had fixed the issue, so that's kind of hilarious in and of itself, but if you look at raid Trader.io, the number of people running keys which should probably be beyond us right now is a little staggering. So many plus 15s and plus 16s completed, and most of those probably wouldn't have been legit keys this week because half of them took several hours. If you're taking 4 hours to do a plus 16 key, you probably can't do the plus 15 in time to actually get the plus 16 key. It's just a really weird situation where anyone with a high enough key can almost guarantee they'll get the plus 10 done for the maximum rewards next week, simply because so many high level keys are already floating around and no one had to do any work to actually get them. If you go from a plus 2 key, you might struggle to get to a plus 10 this week just because Mythic Plus is decently difficult right now. But if you have a plus 10 key already, all you need to do is bash your head against the dungeon until you kill the last boss. It doesn't matter if you take 2 hours or even 8 hours, as long as that last boss gets killed, you'll get the maximum rewards next week. I'm really curious to see how these bugged keys will affect the keys received next week too. Back in Legion, your cache gave you a key which was a few levels lower than your maxed key for the week. If players who did a plus 16 this week get a plus 12 next week, that just creates a really nasty cycle where this bug will affect key runs for weeks to come. And then even if you don't want to run the bugged key, to get a key that's actually runnable, you have to run into the instance, start the dungeon, run back outside, reset the dungeon, and keep doing that over and over again until you get a reasonable level. Bear in mind that you can only enter 10 instances per hour, so if you have a plus 15 key, you can only just and so reduce it down to a plus 5 after 10 minutes of running in and out of the dungeon. Not the most fun experience in the world, and you don't have any control over whether or not you got those bugged keys in the first place. And then we also have the PvP nonsense. Anyone who had played enough ranked PvP to obtain some achievements and rewards at the end of Legion were given the achievements and rewards for this first Battle for Azeroth PvP season as well as soon as they logged on. So there's some free titles and whatnot for anyone who took part in their PvP in Legion, but anyone who had completed their weekly PvP requirements in Legion also had their Battle for Azeroth weekly quest reward automatically completed for them. That's some free gear right there as well. The PvP season was actually put on hold until all of this could be resolved, I'm guessing because they didn't want anyone taking advantage of the free gear, especially from the Mythic Plus cache and getting a higher rank than they arguably should have been able to obtain. It's interesting that they decided to stall the PvP season, but allowed those same players free reign over the newly opened raid encounters, but I guess it's easier to put a PvP season on hold when compared to a PvE season, seeing as we don't really have seasons in PvE. They would also have had to have closed Uldir for half of the day while they figured everything out, which would have affected a lot of players in a really negative way, so I can see why they decided to just roll with it. And just in case you thought all of these bugs were caused by the server resets, if you were one of the super early birds to the party on Tuesday, you could have killed the active world boss twice, once before the reset and once after the reset, and had a chance at loot from both attempts. Anyone who got over to the world boss early enough basically had 2 world bosses this week, and from some reports on the various WoW forums, some players were obtaining items above the current Titan Forge cap. I'm going to take that with a little grain of salt. Personally, I didn't see any items above item level 400, and they're probably very easy to Photoshop anyways, but with everything else going on this week, I wouldn't be too surprised if a few other things we didn't know about went terribly wrong. So this may have been one of the worst raid releases that I personally experienced, and it actually had nothing to do with the raid. It's a pretty terrible collection of bugs for any day of the year, but when Mythic Plus and raids are opening up for the first time in this expansion, and the first PvP season is supposed to start off too, I don't know if there's a worse day for all of this to happen all at once. It's some crazy stuff, and it's definitely been a roller coaster. At least the Mythic cache items were removed, and I'm guessing Blizzard will work towards addressing the other concerns as they see fit over the next few days. I think the worst part of a lot of these bugs is that you didn't really get a choice as to whether or not they ended up affecting you. It's not like you can ask the game to not give you achievements as soon as you log in. I guess you could not open your Mythic cache, but personally I would have been very curious if my cache was openable, and I wasn't too sure why. As for equipping the items, well, I guess that's on each player to decide. From what I've seen and heard about, no one was punished in any way, shape or form relating to these bugs, and I think the dev team handled this in one of the best ways possible. An entire server rollback would have been a huge headache and caused so much frustration. I don't think it should be ever taken so lightly. But that's why the NA servers have kind of been on fire, and why you might have seen a lot of players complaining about this week in particular. I think everything should be smooth sailing from here on out, at least if the Mythic Plus keys get fully reset next week. I'm not too sure how they'll handle the PvP achievements and all that jazz. Maybe they'll just call these ones a freebie and cut their losses. I guess we'll have to wait and see. What are your thoughts on all of these issues? Did you happen to come across some 380 loot magically from your weekly cache this week? Or were you maybe watching this all unfold from the comfort of the EU servers? We'll beta test everything for you as per usual. Leave all your thoughts in the comments section below. A big thank you to all of our supporters over on Patreon. You can see their names floating by on screen. If you want to join these lovely guys and gals, you can find a link in the description below. Remember to leave a like just below the video before you leave, and if you want to see more, make sure to subscribe. But apart from that, thanks for watching folks, good luck and have fun, and as always I will see you next time.